world is on edge. China just turned its back on Russia. The so-called limitless friendship is falling apart. Beijing is cutting imports, freezing subsidies, and quietly walking away from the Kremlin. For Putin, it's a geopolitical disaster and a knife in the back. Russia's economy is collapsing, China is pulling support, and Europe is caught in a new hybrid war, where Moscow and Beijing play both sides. How far will this dangerous game go? Will China become Putin's last lifeline or deliver its final blow? And what will Europe do if these two regimes unite against the West? You're watching Ukraine Today. I'm Zoroslava Klesnikova, and up next we'll show you how Beijing is slowly but surely abandoning Moscow, leaving in the Kremlin isolated, desperate, and out of moves. China has turned its back on Russia. The so-called limitless partnership is falling apart, and this could become a real geopolitical disaster for the Kremlin. Beijing is gradually distancing itself from Moscow, which is already turning into a mere raw materials appendage, forgotten its major global negotiations. According to National Security and Defense Council Chief Alexei Kovalenko, the ongoing talks between China and the United States on strategic rapprochement could have fatal consequences for Russia. Media reports claim that Beijing allegedly offered Washington a $1 trillion investment package in exchange of lifting restrictions on Chinese companies and reducing tariffs. This is a signal Moscow does not want to hear. As Bloomberg reports, during trade negotiations, Chinese representatives offered to invest huge sums in the American economy, but with one important condition: to lift restrictions on the activities of Chinese companies that had been introduced over the past decade of national security reasons.
For Russia, this is a disastrous signal. The boundless partnership with China is losing its weight. Moscow risks forever remaining a raw material appendage, ignored in key agreements. Beijing is diversifying supplies, reducing purchases of Russian energy resources, and shifting its focus to new markets. The Kremlin is losing room for maneuver even within the BRICS framework, and global decisions on investment and security are being made without Russia's participation.
Moscow is turning into an isolated puppet, then even its allies are obvious too. If the US and China agree on a common position on the war against Ukraine, Putin will become an extra in his own game.
While China trades with the US, Moscow pays the price for aggression. Isolation, loss of markets, status as a raw material appendage, and strategic defeat.
Even if Russia continues to strike Ukraine's infrastructure, the West will help Ukraine rebuild, while Russia will be left alone to face devastation and sanctions.
In the future, they may try to impose their will by starting a global war in Europe, but they will lose. However, if the US and China agree on rapprochement, this will not happen, and Russia will lose its development prospects for the next 100 years.
China is no longer saving Moscow, it's writing it off. The Kremlin is left without support, without allies, and without a future. The so-called limitless partnership and the moment real money and major players come into view. China is turning away from Russia. The consequences will be significant. That's how experts describe Beijing's latest move, as it cut back purchases for most Russian new materials and effectively rolls back its covert support for the Russian economy. According to Ukrainian's Foreign Intelligence Service, in September, the Chinese government ended unofficial subsidies that have previously offset cost and kept Russian exports competitive.
In September, the Chinese government ended unofficial subsidies that helped state-owned companies import copper and nickel from Russia. Previously, these benefits, in the form of discounts or fixed payments, offset logistics costs, provided competitive advantages to Russian suppliers, and maintained the stability of supply chains.
The decision is part of a broader strategy to optimize state spending and diversify imports. China is actively investing in resources extraction in Indonesia, Africa, and Latin America, gradually replacing Russian goods. The main goal is to protect its domestic market from price distortions caused by Russia selling metals and massive discounts in an attempt to survive Western sanctions. Beijing has now reduced imports of most Russian raw materials. Intelligence reports emphasize that the consequences for Russian companies will be painful. The competitiveness of their products in China is rapidly declining. The Kremlin, which for years boasted of its strategic partnership, is now facing cold calculation. Beijing acts slowly in its own interests. Despite this, on September 15th, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson tried to ease tensions, stating that economic cooperation between China and Russia is lawful and not direct against any third parties. He also urged other countries not to interfere in relations between Chinese and Russian companies. But the fact remains, China is reducing its dependence on Russia, cutting purchases, removing subsidies, and prioritizing its own stability. For Moscow, this means only the thing: the era of limitless partnership is over, and the Kremlin is once again left alone with its sanctions, discounted states, and failures.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
And although opinions differ, Europe is under threat. Russia is waging a full-scale hybrid war against the West, with China gradually joining in. The continent, which has considered peace the norm of decades, is once again feeling the chill of war, but this time it is being fought without tanks or missiles. According to Bloomberg, Europe has found itself at the epicenter of a campaign of unlimited blackmail and activity coming from the all direction. Cyber attacks, wave of disinformation, economic pressure and provocation. This is the new reality. China has not acted as aggressively as Russia so far, but it has already been linked to a number of unusual incidents, including damage to Andaria claims in the Baltic Sea. Its cyber attacks are becoming increasingly ambitious, and its disinformation campaign are more closely coordinated with Russia's. According to Western analysts, Moscow and Beijing are gradually forming a dangerous alliance aimed at undermining Western unity and making Europe weaker, more divided and more complained. While the Kremlin attacks through propaganda and illimitation, China is subtly driving a political wedge into the transatlantic community, building proper countries in Southeast Europe. Europe now stands on the edge of a new era, an era of hybrid threats, where the enemy may not always wear military uniform but always target the continent's stability and future. China, Putin's last lifeline. How long will Beijing keep Russia afloat? No matter how Putin spins it, China is his last lifeline. Beijing is keeping Russia's sinking economy afloat, fueling its war machine with microchips, components, and shady trade schemes. Without China, Moscow's war would grit to a halt. But for how long will Beijing risk it all to save a Kremlin regime? And could this friendship soon turn into a trap for the Kremlin itself? Full story in our report.
China is Russia's main partner, helping it keep its economy afloat and wage war in Ukraine.
They shouted that, "Well done." Clerky, yes, well done. Hooray! On the Chinese one.
I'm spreading out.
On the very Patelzhan,
Children's contacts with President Vladimir Putin in various forms on the platform of the dynamic and long-term development of Chinese-Russian relations. Thank you very much.
But is that really the case? After all, at the same time, China denies selling weapons or components to Russia, and Chinese banks have stopped transactions with Russia because of sanctions. These are
Pairs threes, tens of millions of Chinese soldiers. That would be just what we need right now. But Why do you think so?
Why not?
Why? Do you really think only soldiers should die?
Just look at the Belgorod region. I think how much we lack the Chinese People's Army.
Very often we hear statements from China that China has never sold weapons to Russia and that China supports the territorial integrity of Ukraine and wants an end to the Russian-Ukrainian war.
Just 3 years ago, propagandists were rejoicing, saying, let Western companies leave, we'll buy everything from China.
Now we've bought a wonderful, completely Chinese car. It's amazing. Many, many times cheaper than the cars we used to buy before. I bought myself 3 pairs of Gucci shoes. 2,000 rubles each. Wonderful. Probably made somewhere in China as well. I hope here too. Fake, of course. As a matter of principle, I only buy fakes now.
There's not even any need to comment on how that turned out. And that so-called Chinese support for the Russian economy resulted in the bankruptcy of Russian manufacturers.
And just look at what, for example, the soldiers are using. What, are they using Russian-made vehicles? You have to be a real patriot to drive a Patriot, because it costs a fortune. It breaks down all the time, and the spare parts are insanely expensive. That's why the guys drive Chinese vehicles. And now they need motorcycles. Russian ones aren't available. For some reason, that's how it turns out, right? There are very few Russian ones. Actually, there are none at all. So what are we even talking about? No, there are no Russian patriots at all. What, you didn't know that?
If you look at the Russian Federation from an economic perspective, they're simply used as a basic sales market. Except for, let's say, the military industry, which is a significant sector. But as for civilian engineering, its presence has practically been reduced to absolutely zero.
And Russia has literally turned into a raw materials appendage for China. By the way, Foreign Minister Lavrov came up with a very apt metaphor calling Putin Xi Jinping's footstool.
As they say in the East, a guest follows the host's step. So all the programs, of course, depend on the gracious proposals that the Chinese president and his team have made to our president. And basically, from an economic standpoint, all China needs is cheap raw materials, which, by the way, Russia possesses in vast abundance. It's not just natural gas and crude oil, but also significant reserves of lithium, extensive timber resources, numerous valuable metals, and in fact, a substantial amount of gold as well. In other words, all the things that are then used in China itself to produce goods for the entire world.
Moreover, this situation manifests itself in completely different aspects. In China, new official geographic maps have been approved on which part of Russian territory, the Bolshoi-Ussuriysky Island, is recognized as Chinese territory. In fact, the Chinese have already settled huge parts of Siberia and turned the territory into their own colonies.
The Chinese dragon is unlikely to stay within its own country, simply because, by the way, it actually has certain historical claims to a significant part of our Far East. And that's a fact.
Of course, at first there was enthusiasm, but gradually it faded, and eventually we all realized that Asina had become a Chinese colony. It's simply a slave-owning enterprise, a slave camp, or a prison, if you will, where they put overseers to keep the workers in line. Because the resentment is still there, no matter what. And the workers went out in Asina to protest with the slogan, Asina is not China. And they also they regularly threaten, saying that you won't be able to get a job anywhere in this city. Here's your black mark. So sit quietly and keep your mouth shut for your 15 to 30,000.
They are very good at waiting. And this ability to wait, it's also about the integration of the Chinese into the territory of the Russian Federation. And this, in fact, is already essentially an annexation. Moreover, if you pay attention, on some Chinese maps, certain regions of the Russian Federation are already labeled with Chinese names. Well, listen, why would you even need to declare war for that?
Russian television is already showing segments about how to find a Chinese husband. And in Russian schools and government institutions, Chinese language is being actively studied.
People are divided into two camps, those who want to learn and those who are skeptical about it, saying, why do we need Chinese? We're not planning to go anywhere. I'll give you a very simple answer, actually. I say, I'm not teaching you Chinese here. I'm using the Chinese language to make you think for yourselves. And that skill will always come in handy.
Putin constantly tries to characterize relations with China as a strong friendship, but Xi Jinping literally spat in his face. Xi took away from Russia that very great victory.
And just yesterday, my friend and representative of the PRC treated me to this kind of Peking duck. I'll be honest with you, there were 2 pieces, and I thought I'd only eat one. You get what I mean, right? But I couldn't resist. I ate the second one too, you know, it was just so delicious.
China and Russia, being the main theaters of military action in World War II, made a decisive contribution to the victory over fascism and thus laid the cornerstone of the post-war world order.
China and Russia are neither friends nor partners. And here's what's important. As soon as China has enough motivation to limit its cooperation with the Russian Federation, believe me, it will do so. Russia, in fact, has no other choice. Either befriend China now or face economic and consequently political, military, and all other kinds of collapse at the same time.
It turns out that China is not helping Russia save its economy or win the war at all, but is simply taking advantage of its weakness to take its resources and strengthen its own influence in Asia.
That's all for today on Ukraine Today. If you want the truth louder than propaganda, like, comment and subscribe. Want to stand with us, become a sponsor and join our fight on the information front line. Your support helps us expose the lies, reveal the cracks in Putin's empire and defend Ukrainians' voice worldwide. Stay informed, stay strong and stay with Ukraine.